The paramedic's name was Sasha Tillman, and she had worked Kensington for 6 years. She had seen everything. That was what she told her husband every time he asked her to transfer to a quieter district, that there was nothing left in that neighbourhood capable of surprising her. On the night of October 14th, 2024, she found out she was wrong. The call came in at 2:17 in the morning. Male, unresponsive, found in the stairwell of a building on Gurney Street. By the time Tillman's unit arrived, the man was blue from the lips to the fingernails, a specific shade that experienced paramedics recognize before they even exit the vehicle. She pulled the Narcan from her kit without breaking stride. Standard dose, nasal spray, right nostril. She counted to 30. Nothing happened. She administered a second dose. Still nothing. A third dose brought a faint twitch in the left hand. Not a revival, just the body's last electrical signal. The man on the floor weighed maybe 140 pounds. He was 29 years old. His name, they would learn later from a hospital bracelet still on his wrist from a visit 3 weeks prior, was Danny Rourke. He was breathing, technically, 11 times per minute, each breath shallow enough that Tillman had to watch his chest carefully to confirm it was happening at all. 4 doses of naloxone. That was what it took to get him into the ambulance alive. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. In a standard fentanyl overdose, and by 2024, nearly every opioid overdose in Kensington was a fentanyl overdose. 1 or 2 doses of Narcan is typically enough to reverse the effect and bring a person back. The drug that reversal agent is designed to fight binds to opioid receptors in the brain, and Narcan works by knocking it off those receptors almost instantly. Paramedics had come to rely on that mechanism the way a surgeon relies on a scalpel. Precise, predictable, fast. Tillman had personally reversed dozens of overdoses in a single shift. She knew the timing. She knew what the face looked like when it started working. Danny Rourke's face didn't change. At Jefferson Hospital, the emergency physician on duty ordered a full toxicology panel within minutes of arrival. The standard screen, the one that catches fentanyl, heroin, oxycodone, methamphetamine, cocaine, came back with something unexpected. Fentanyl was present, but at a level that alone would not explain the severity of what she was seeing. There was a second compound flagged, not identified, just flagged. A molecular signature the lab's automated system had never encountered before, catalogued under the clinical shorthand for an unknown substance. Novel synthetic compound, further analysis required. The physician had seen that notation before, twice, both times in the past 4 months. She didn't know what she was looking at. Nobody in that building did. In 2023, the United States recorded 107,543 drug overdose deaths. That number is almost impossible to hold in the mind as a single fact, so consider instead that it is larger than the total number of American military deaths during the entire Vietnam War, a conflict that lasted nearly 2 decades and defined a generation. The overdose crisis has been killing Americans at Vietnam scale every single year since 2017, and every year the number has climbed. The primary driver of that death toll has been synthetic opioids, fentanyl first, then fentanyl mixed with xylazine, a veterinary tranquilizer that earned the street name Tranq and turned parts of Philadelphia into something that looked like a war zone in slow motion. Limbs rotting, wounds that wouldn't close. People sleeping in the street in temperatures below freezing because the drug's sedative effect was so powerful it suppressed even the most basic survival instincts. Tranq changed the crisis. The medical community spent 3 years trying to adapt to it. They were still adapting when something new arrived. In late 2023 and through 2024, forensic toxicology labs in 6 states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, and Michigan, began reporting trace detections of a compound that didn't match any substance on the current DEA scheduling list. The detections came from two sources: post-mortem toxicology from overdose deaths and chemical analysis of C Street samples. The compound appeared in small quantities at first, then in larger ones. Then it began appearing without fentanyl, on its own, as the primary substance. The compound belonged to a chemical family called benzimidazole opioids. That family includes several drugs that are already known, some of them scheduled, some of them not, all of them extraordinarily potent. But this specific compound had characteristics that set it apart even within that family. Its estimated analgesic potency, that is, its pain-killing strength, was approximately 10,000 times that of morphine. 10,000 times. Fentanyl, the drug that has killed more Americans than any other substance in history, is roughly 100 times more potent than morphine. The compound appearing in those toxicology reports was 100 times more powerful than fentanyl. The compound had a name. It was called Bromadoline. What made the detections particularly alarming to the handful of researchers and law enforcement chemists who noticed them wasn't just the potency. Potency alone, while terrifying, was a known variable in the synthetic opioid crisis. The alarming part was the pharmacological profile. Bromadoline didn't behave like fentanyl in the brain. It bound differently to opioid receptors, held on longer, and metabolized in a way that made naloxone, the reversal agent that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives during the fentanyl era, significantly less effective. Not useless, but less effective. Enough less effective that the standard emergency protocol, the one every paramedic in the country had been trained on, the one Sasha Tillman had used hundreds of times, might not be enough. Danny Rourke survived that night by the span of a single breath. Not everyone did. The question that the physicians, the toxicologists, and the handful of researchers who'd already begun tracking Bromadoline could not answer. Not in October 2024, and not in the months before it, was deceptively simple. Where did this come from? A drug this potent, this structurally sophisticated, this precisely engineered. It didn't appear from nowhere. It had a history. It had a laboratory. It had a moment of creation, a scientist who first synthesized it, a purpose for which it was originally designed. Drugs like this always do. The answer to that question didn't begin in Kensington, or in the seized samples of a DEA field office, or in any American city at all. It began somewhere else entirely, in a different country, in a different era, in a world so removed from the streets of Philadelphia that the connection seemed impossible. But the connection was there. It had always been there, and understanding it meant going back to a place that no longer existed, to a government that had already collapsed, to a laboratory where a man who believed he was helping people wrote down a formula that would outlast everything he knew. The city of Leningrad in 1976 was a place of controlled surfaces and hidden interiors. The facades of its buildings along the Neva River were magnificent. Tsarist architecture preserved under Soviet governance like a museum no one had asked to live inside. But behind those facades, in the research institutes and pharmaceutical laboratories that occupied converted pre-revolutionary buildings in the city's academic district, something genuinely new was being built, not preserved. Built. Dr. Alexei Voronin was 34 years old when he first synthesized the compound that would eventually be classified as Bromadoline. He worked in a state pharmacology institute whose full name was 12 words long, and whose actual function was known to perhaps 200 people in the entire country. The Institute's official mandate was the development of analgesic compounds for civilian medical use. Its real mandate, the one that determined funding levels, staffing allocations, and the pressure applied to its researchers during quarterly reviews, was battlefield pharmacology. The problem the Soviet military needed solved was specific. Wounded soldiers in combat conditions had a narrow window of effective action after injury. Standard morphine worked, but it sedated. A soldier who couldn't move, couldn't think clearly, couldn't follow orders was a tactical liability as much as a medical problem. What the military wanted was a compound that eliminated pain without eliminating function, something that kept a man on his feet, kept his hands steady, kept his mind sharp enough to follow a command, while his body was doing things that should have made all of those things impossible. Voronin's laboratory had been working on this problem for 4 years before he arrived. The previous lead researcher had produced 2 candidate compounds, both abandoned after animal trials showed unacceptable toxicity profiles. The pressure to deliver something viable was not abstract. It arrived in the form of a ministry official who visited the institute every 6 months and left notes in a green folder that the institute director read alone in his office, with the door closed. What Voronin brought to the problem was a specific theoretical framework drawn from his doctoral research on receptor binding dynamics, the mechanism by which pain-killing molecules attach to cells in the brain and spinal cord. Most opioid research at the time focused on mu-opioid receptors, the primary target of morphine and its derivatives. Voronin's hypothesis was that a compound engineered to bind with unusual persistence, holding the receptor longer than morphine, resisting the natural process by which the brain clears drugs from its system, would produce both stronger and longer-lasting pain relief at smaller doses. Smaller doses meant less sedation. Less sedation meant functional soldiers. The benzimidazole scaffold, a specific molecular architecture, a particular arrangement of atoms that chemists use as a foundation the way architects use a steel frame, had been explored in Western pharmaceutical research primarily for antiparasitic and antifungal applications. Voronin's insight was structural. He recognized that a modified benzimidazole core could be engineered to mimic the shape of naturally occurring opioid molecules closely enough to bind the same receptors, but with a grip that natural opioids couldn't match. He was right. His first functional synthesis, compound designation B77 in the Institute's internal numbering system, produced results in rat trials that made the entire laboratory fall quiet when the data was first read aloud at a team meeting. Pain response, eliminated. Motor function, intact. Duration, 6 hours on a single dose that was, by weight, a fraction of what morphine required. The institute director read the results twice. Then he picked up the phone. Voronin spent the next 3 years refining B77. The early version had a problem, a narrow therapeutic window, meaning the gap between a dose that worked and a dose that killed was uncomfortably small. Too much of it, and the compound's effect on respiratory function became catastrophic. The same quality that made it bind so persistently to pain receptors also made it bind to the receptors that regulated breathing. The body's automatic instruction to inhale simply quieted. That problem was not unique to B77. It was, in fact, the defining challenge of opioid pharmacology, the thing that made powerful painkillers dangerous by definition. But Voronin's compound presented the problem at an extreme. The ratio was worse than morphine, worse than any compound in the Institute's previous research portfolio. He worked on it methodically, adjusted the molecular side chains, the structural appendages that influenced how the compound attached to different receptor subtypes, modified the binding geometry, ran another animal series. The therapeutic window widened slightly. Not enough. He adjusted again. In 1979, after 2 more years of iteration, he produced a version, internally designated B77C, that showed a meaningfully improved safety ratio while retaining the core properties that had made the original compound remarkable. It was still more dangerous than morphine, but it was also roughly 10 times more powerful, with a duration of action 3 times as long and an effect on motor function that the animal data consistently described as minimal. The Institute submitted a formal development proposal to the Ministry. The Ministry approved further funding. There is a specific kind of optimism that exists inside a research laboratory at the moment when years of work align into a single confirmed result. It has nothing to do with the eventual application. The researcher who spent 7 years developing a more efficient explosive is not thinking about the blast radius. They are thinking about the combustion rate, the molecular elegance, the problem finally solved. Voronin, in the winter of 1979, believed he had done something important for medicine. He kept meticulous notebooks, the kind of records that reflected genuine scientific pride, not just institutional compliance. His entries from that period describe the compound's properties with the careful precision of someone who intended the work to last. It did last. That was the problem. The Soviet Union's pharmacological research programs ran on a rhythm of 5-year plans and ministry reviews, and B-77C moved through that system with unusual speed for a compound that had never been tested in humans. By 1981, the Institute had prepared a preliminary dossier for Phase 1 human trials, the first stage of testing in which a new drug is administered to a small number of healthy volunteers to assess basic safety. The dossier was submitted. The Ministry's Medical Oversight Committee reviewed it. The approval never came, not because of safety concerns. The committee's review notes, which would not be accessible to researchers outside Russia for decades, indicate that the compound was flagged not for its toxicity profile, but for a classification issue. B-77C was considered too strategically significant for civilian trial protocols. The military application took precedence. The compound would be developed through a separate channel, one that had different oversight, different documentation requirements, and considerably less transparency. Voronin was informed that his project was being transferred to a different division. He was thanked for his contribution. He was not invited to continue working on it. He returned to his laboratory and began a new project on anti-inflammatory compounds. His notebooks on B-77C remained at the Institute, filed in a cabinet in the administrative wing. He did not ask for them back. In the Soviet research system, asking questions about transferred projects was understood to be a category of mistake that a careful person did not make twice. For most of the 1980s, B-77C existed in a bureaucratic half-life, somewhere between an active military research program and an archived file. The compound had a formula, it had animal data, it had a name in an internal Soviet classification system, but it had no human trials, no manufacturing process, and no practical deployment. The military development channel it had been transferred to apparently moved slowly, or encountered its own obstacles, or simply deprioritized a compound that required more refinement before it could be weaponized effectively. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, not metaphorically but nearly literally, the institutional infrastructure that had housed B-77CE ceased to exist. The Ministry of Defence's Pharmaceutical Research Division was defunded. Institutes were shuttered, merged, privatized, or simply abandoned. Researchers went months without pay. Some emigrated. Some found work in the private sector. Some stayed and watched their life's work sit in filing cabinets in buildings that no longer had heating. Voronin's notebook stayed in that cabinet. But data, unlike buildings, doesn't require a functioning government to survive. The formula for B-77C, the precise molecular structure, the synthesis pathway, the binding characteristics that made it so remarkable, existed in documents that were now, in the chaos of the Soviet collapse, effectively unguarded. Research institutes that had once operated under strict state security were now operated by skeleton staffs who hadn't been paid in 3 months. No one broke in, no one needed to. The data moved the way information always moves when the walls come down, slowly at first, then faster than anyone thought possible, through channels that left no record of their use. By the mid-1990s, fragments of Soviet-era pharmaceutical research were circulating in scientific communities across Eastern Europe. Some of it was published in obscure journals. Some of it was traded between chemists who understood its value. Some of it was simply copied, a technical document photographed, a formula transcribed by hand into a notebook that then travelled west in a coat pocket. Whether B77C was among the data that moved that way, or whether it was independently rediscovered later by chemists working from published benzimidazole research, is a question that has no confirmed answer. What is confirmed is what happened next. The internet in 2010 was already old enough to have developed its own underground economy, but young enough that law enforcement still didn't fully understand its architecture. On forums hosted on servers in jurisdictions that didn't answer American subpoenas, a specific kind of trade had been operating for years, not drugs exactly, but the chemical instructions for making them. Synthesis routes, precursor lists, molecular diagrams shared between people who referred to themselves as researchers and who, in some cases, actually were. The research chemical market had a particular logic that made it almost legally bulletproof for most of the 2000s. The mechanism was simple. If a substance wasn't specifically listed on a country's controlled substances schedule, it wasn't illegal to manufacture, sell, or possess. Chemists, some working in legitimate settings, most not, would identify compounds that produce drug-like effects through mechanisms similar to scheduled substances, synthesize them under slightly different molecular configurations, and sell them online as not for human consumption. Bath salts, plant food, research samples. The label didn't matter, the effect did. By 2015, that market had matured into something sophisticated enough to have supply chains, customer reviews, and shipping operations that rivaled small pharmaceutical distributors. The benzimidazole opioid family entered this ecosystem not through a single dramatic moment, but through a gradual process of chemical discovery and economic incentive. Researchers in China, some working in legitimate pharmaceutical chemistry, some operating in the grey space between academic research and commercial production, had been exploring benzimidazole-based compounds for years. The scaffold's properties were published in open scientific literature. The leap from published chemistry to synthesis wasn't trivial, but for someone with graduate-level organic chemistry training and access to standard laboratory equipment, it was achievable. The first benzimidazole opioids to appear in the research chemical market weren't bromadoline. They were structural cousins, compounds with names like etonitazine and metonitazine, which began appearing in European drug monitoring reports around 2019. Etonitazine was estimated to be somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 times more potent than morphine. It killed people in Belgium, Estonia, and the United Kingdom before most toxicology labs had developed a reliable test for it. By the time regulatory agencies in those countries scheduled it, the chemists producing it had already moved to the next variant. That was the pattern. Schedule one compound, and the next morning someone publishes a synthesis route for a molecule that differs by a single atom, different enough to escape the new law, identical enough in effect to be just as lethal. Claire Voss was 31 years old in 2019 and working as a forensic chemist for the DEA's Special Testing and Research Laboratory in Dulles, Virginia. Her job, in its most basic description, was to identify unknown substances in seized drug samples, to take a powder or a pill or a residue scraped from a piece of foil and tell the agency exactly what it was. Most days that meant fentanyl, or one of its analogues, or methamphetamine, or cocaine cut with something unexpected. The work was technically demanding and largely invisible. No jury ever heard her name, no press conference featured her results. She worked in a building with no windows in her section of the lab, under fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious awareness. In the fall of 2019, a seized sample from a traffic stop in West Virginia came through her lab. The package it arrived in was labelled, by the field agent who submitted it, as suspected fentanyl. The mass spectrometry reading told a different story. The compound's molecular signature didn't match any entry in the DEA's reference library. Voss ran it twice, then sent the spectral data to 2 colleagues for independent verification. All 3 readings agreed: benzimidazole scaffold, opioid active configuration, no match to any scheduled substance. She filed a report, standard format. She noted the structural family, the estimated potency range based on the molecular configuration, and the absence of any existing legal classification. The report went up the chain. A supervisor acknowledged receipt. The sample was archived. Nothing happened for 6 weeks. The compound in that West Virginia sample was not bromadoline. It was isotonitazine, a benzimidazole opioid that the DEA would eventually schedule on an emergency basis in 2020, after enough deaths had accumulated to make inaction impossible to defend. But the process of identifying it, tracking its spread, and pushing it through the scheduling mechanism took 14 months from Voss's first report to the final classification. 14 months during which it remained legal, during which it continued to appear in drug supplies in at least 11 states, during which it continued to appear in toxicology reports from overdose deaths, filed under cause of death, fentanyl. The misattribution wasn't incompetence. Benzimidazole opioids were so new to American drug supplies that standard immunoassay drug screens, the fast, inexpensive tests used in emergency rooms and field settings, didn't detect them. A patient who died from isotonitazine would test positive for nothing on a standard panel, or would show fentanyl if fentanyl was also present in the mix. The novel compound was invisible to the instruments designed to find it. That invisibility was not accidental. It was a property that anyone selling the compound for street use would find extremely valuable. By 2021, the benzimidazole opioid family had established a foothold in the American drug supply that was larger than anyone outside a handful of forensic laboratories understood. Metonitazine, protonitazine, flunitazine, each one slightly different, each one appearing in seized samples and post-mortem toxicology reports in patterns that, when mapped geographically, traced the same distribution routes used by every other drug that had swept through the country in the previous decade. The Ohio River Corridor, Interstate 70 through the Midwest, the northeastern seaboard from Baltimore to Boston. The compounds moved through the existing fentanyl supply chain because that infrastructure was already in place. The distributors, the cutting operations, the last-mile dealers. Benzimidazole opioids required no separate network. They slotted in as additives at first, then as partial replacements, then, in some markets, as primary products. A kilogram of a potent benzimidazole compound bought from a manufacturer in a country with loose pharmaceutical regulations cost a fraction of what an equivalent quantity of fentanyl cost. The economics were not subtle. Somewhere in that supply chain, in a specific cutting operation, in a specific city, at a specific moment that has not been publicly documented, bromadoline entered the American drug supply for the first time. The exact date is unknown. What the seized sample data shows is that it was present, in trace quantities, in at least 3 samples analysed by regional DEA laboratories in 2022. Those samples came from Pennsylvania and Ohio. Voss didn't see those particular samples. She'd moved by then from the Dulles laboratory to a joint research position with a university toxicology program in Philadelphia, a role that gave her access to post-mortem data from the city's medical examiner's office. She was building a database. She'd been building it for 2 years, logging every novel compound that appeared in overdose toxicology reports, cross-referencing with seized sample analyses from the DEA and state police labs, trying to construct a picture of what was actually moving through the drug supply, as opposed to what official statistics said was moving through it. The picture that was forming was not one that matched the official account. The gap between what Voss could see in her database and what public health agencies were reporting publicly came down to a single technical problem: attribution. When a person died from an overdose in Kensington in 2022, the medical examiner's report listed a cause of death. If fentanyl was present in the toxicology, and it almost always was because fentanyl was in virtually everything, the death was attributed to fentanyl, a secondary compound that appeared at lower concentrations in a molecular family that the standard testing protocol wasn't specifically designed to detect, might appear as an unidentified signal in the spectral data, or it might not appear at all, depending on which testing methodology the laboratory used. Voss had begun specifically requesting expanded testing on samples where the fentanyl concentration alone seemed inconsistent with the severity of the overdose, cases where paramedics had used multiple doses of Narcan, cases where a person who had used regularly for years, who had built tolerance to levels that would kill a first-time user, had died anyway on what their associates described as a normal amount. Those cases had something in common. Not in every instance, but in enough of them to constitute a pattern. The pattern had a shape. The shape matched the benzimidazole family. She was compiling the data into what she intended to submit as a peer-reviewed study. She had enough for a preliminary finding. She needed another 6 months to have enough for a conclusion that couldn't be dismissed. She didn't know in late 2022 that the compound appearing most consistently in her flagged cases was specifically bromadoline, not because the data didn't show it, but because she didn't yet have a confirmed reference standard for bromadoline specifically to match against. The compound was so new to American forensic chemistry that the certified reference material needed to make a definitive identification had only recently been synthesized by a specialist laboratory. She ordered the reference standard in November 2022. It arrived in January 2023. What she found when she ran it against her archived samples made her sit still at her workstation for a long time before she did anything else. Bromadoline wasn't new to her samples. It had been present in post-mortem toxicology from Philadelphia overdose deaths for at least 18 months before she had the tools to identify it by name. 18 months of deaths, attributed to fentanyl, recorded as fentanyl, filed as fentanyl. And somewhere in that 18 months, in a stairwell, in an alley, in one of the narrow row houses on the streets that fed into Kensington Avenue, a 27-year-old man named Danny Rourke had used something for the first time that wasn't what his dealer said it was, and had felt something he had never felt before, and had survived it, and had gone back for more. He didn't know what it was called. He only knew what it did. Danny Rourke was born on March 3rd, 1995 in Temple University Hospital, 4 blocks from the neighbourhood that would define every significant fact of his life. His mother, Patrice, was 22 and working the early shift at a laundromat on Lehigh Avenue. His father, whose name Danny would later find on a court document when he was 16 and looking for something else entirely, left before Danny started school. Patrice raised him in a second-floor apartment on Cambria Street where the radiator worked from November to February if you hit it in a specific spot, and where the window in Danny's room looked directly into the window of the identical building 12 feet away. He was not a troubled child in the way that retrospective accounts of addiction tend to construct troubled childhoods. His third-grade teacher wrote on a report card that he was curious and good with numbers. He played street football on the block until dark. He had friends, a grandmother who lived 6 streets over and made rice and beans on Sundays, a mother who was tired in the specific way that women working 2 jobs are tired, not defeated, just worn in the places that showed. The first pill came at 16, not from a stranger. From a friend whose older brother had a prescription for Percocet after a construction site injury, and who had more pills than he needed and less money than he wanted. Danny had twisted his knee badly in a pickup game the week before. The knee still hurt. The pill cost $3. He took half. Then he took the other half an hour later. What happened in the next 4 hours was, by the pharmacological standards that govern opioid addiction research, entirely predictable. The oxycodone in that Percocet tablet bound to mu-opioid receptors distributed throughout Danny's brain and spinal cord, triggering a release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, at a magnitude several times larger than any naturally occurring stimulus. The pain in his knee disappeared within 20 minutes. The anxiety he carried in his chest, the specific low-grade tension that was simply the texture of being 16 and poor in Kensington, also disappeared. Not numbed. Gone. Replaced by a warmth that started in his stomach and spread outward, until even the tips of his fingers felt different. He had never felt that way before. The significance of that fact, that a brain which has experienced that feeling will spend years afterward trying to return to it, was not something Danny understood that afternoon. He just knew he wanted it again. The escalation from recreational opioid use to physical dependence follows a timeline that varies by person, by substance, by frequency of use, and by a set of genetic factors that researchers are still working to fully map. For Danny, it took approximately 8 months to move from occasional pills to daily use. By 17, he was buying on the street because his access to discounted prescription bottles had dried up. By 18, the economics of buying pills individually had become untenable. A single oxycodone 30mg tablet on the street in Kensington cost $20 to $30, and the amount his body now required to avoid withdrawal had outpaced any income he could generate. Heroin cost a fraction of that. Same mechanism, same receptor, same relief. He made the switch on a Tuesday in October in a parking lot behind a check-cashing place on Allegheny Avenue. He was 18 years and 7 months old. He had been trying to avoid this specific decision for 4 months, which in Kensington, for someone already physically dependent on opioids, and without the financial resources to maintain a pill habit, was longer than most people lasted. Patrice found out 6 weeks later. She'd seen enough in that neighborhood to recognize the signs without needing to be told. She got him into a program. He lasted 11 days before he left. He tried again at 19. That one lasted 3 weeks. The gap between those attempts and the next serious one stretched to almost 2 years. A period during which Danny's use continued and deepened and became, in the way that long-term addiction reshapes a person's relationship to time, simply the structure of his days. Kensington in the early 2000s had a specific rhythm that people inside it understood and people outside it did not. The neighborhood had been a manufacturing district once. The kind of place where a man with a strong back and no education beyond 8th grade could earn a wage that supported a family. The factories had closed across several decades, and what replaced them was a particular ecosystem of survival that included corner stores that cashed checks for a fee, payday loan shops, churches that served hot meals on Thursdays, and a drug market that operated with the organizational efficiency of a business that understood its customer base intimately. Danny understood that market the way a person understands the layout of a city they've lived in their whole life, instinctively, without needing to think about it. He knew which corners were active at which hours. He knew which products were reliable and which were cut with enough garbage to make you sick without getting you high. He knew which dealers weighed accurately and which didn't. This knowledge was not criminal expertise in his own understanding of it. It was navigation. The same cognitive work that a suburban commuter applies to traffic patterns and gas prices. His tolerance by 2019, when he was 24, was severe enough that the amounts he used daily would have been a fatal overdose for a person without his history. His body had adapted. It had restructured its baseline chemistry around the presence of opioids, so that the drugs now produced not euphoria, but normalcy, and their absence produced a physical crisis: sweating, cramping, bone pain, an inability to sleep, that was not metaphorically described as the body eating itself. It felt to people who had experienced it exactly like that. Fentanyl changed his life in a specific and measurable way. It made everything cheaper and more dangerous simultaneously. When heroin from Mexico began to be cut with fentanyl, and then when fentanyl began to replace heroin almost entirely in Eastern markets, the economics shifted in ways that benefited street-level users financially, while multiplying the lethality of every transaction. Danny could get high for less money. He also couldn't be certain from one purchase to the next what concentration of fentanyl he was receiving, because the mixing was never precise. Hotspots, pockets of powder in an otherwise diluted batch where the fentanyl had clustered, killed experienced users who had survived years on the street without incident. He carried Narcan. He knew how to use it. He had used it on 3 different people. One of them a woman he didn't know, found in a doorway on Tusculum Street, whose breathing he monitored for 40 minutes until the paramedics arrived because she had no one else. Then xylazine arrived, and the rules changed again. Xylazine, the veterinary tranquilizer that the streets called Tranq, wasn't an opioid. Narcan didn't reverse it. When it was mixed into the fentanyl supply, which became standard practice in Philadelphia by 2021, overdoses became more complex and harder to reverse. The wounds it caused when used regularly, deep necrotic ulcers that opened on the arms and legs of long-term users, wounds that didn't respond to standard wound care and in some cases required amputation, were unlike anything the city's harm reduction workers had encountered before. Danny had scars on his left forearm from Tranq exposure that he covered with a long-sleeved shirt regardless of temperature. In the late summer of 2023, the product available on his usual corner changed. Not obviously, no announcement, no different packaging. The powder looked the same, but the effect was different in ways that Danny registered immediately and filed away with the practical attention he applied to every change in the supply. It hit faster, not by seconds, by a margin that felt instantaneous in a way that even fentanyl, which was already extraordinarily fast-acting, didn't match. The warmth was more complete, spreading through his body in a wave that reached his extremities before he had finished the thought that something was different. The duration was longer, substantially longer, hours longer, in a way that initially seemed like an unambiguous improvement. The come-down was different too, not worse in a way he could have specifically articulated at the time, just different, heavier. A return to baseline that felt slower and more complete than fentanyl's come down, as if the drug hadn't just left but had taken something with it on the way out. He woke the next morning with his jaw clenched and a headache behind his left eye that 2 ibuprofen didn't touch. He bought again that evening. Of course he did. The logic of physical dependence at that stage of severity doesn't have room for the kind of deliberation the word decision implies. The body's position was simple. It needed what it had had yesterday, whatever that was. His dealer, when Danny asked what the new product was, gave an answer that was common in that market. A shrug, a name that wasn't a chemical name, but a street descriptor that meant nothing beyond the block where it was used. The dealer himself almost certainly didn't know what he was selling. The information didn't travel down the supply chain. It rarely did. What bromadoline does in the human brain is, in the language of pharmacology, a matter of receptor kinetics, the speed and tenacity with which a molecule attaches to its target and the duration of that attachment. Opioids work by binding to mu-opioid receptors, which are distributed throughout the central nervous system and which regulate pain, reward, breathing, and a cascade of other functions. Most opioids bind, produce their effect, and are then cleared from the receptor by the brain's natural housekeeping processes, enzymes that break down drug molecules, allowing the receptor to return to its resting state. Bromadoline's binding affinity, the strength of its grip on the receptor, was, based on the animal data that Voronin had generated in 1979 and the laboratory modelling done decades later by researchers who didn't know Voronin's name, significantly higher than fentanyl's. It held on. The receptor couldn't easily shake it loose. This was why the duration of effect was longer. It was also why naloxone, which works by competing with opioids for receptor space, knocking the opioid off the receptor and claiming the position itself, had reduced effectiveness against it. Knocking something off a receptor it's gripping that hard requires a force that a standard Narcan dose doesn't reliably supply. Danny Rourke's body was running this biochemical process without his knowledge of it. He knew something was different. He didn't know what or why. He knew his tolerance was building faster than it ever had before. Within 6 weeks of the supply change, he needed more than he had needed with fentanyl to reach the same state. He knew the morning headaches were becoming a feature rather than an exception. He knew none of this was good. He also knew that the alternative, withdrawal from whatever this was, had already announced its character in the 2 occasions when he'd gone 18 hours without it, and that character was worse than anything fentanyl withdrawal had produced. He had been using opioids for 11 years. He had withdrawn from heroin twice and from fentanyl once. He understood withdrawal the way a person understands a recurring medical condition, with familiarity, with dread, with the practical knowledge of what it required to survive it. What he felt in those 18-hour gaps was not the withdrawal he knew. It was longer. It started earlier, within 8 hours of his last use rather than the 12 to 16 hours that fentanyl withdrawal typically required. It produced a restlessness in his legs that was so severe he couldn't remain still. Pacing his apartment at 3 a.m, unable to lie down, unable to stand in one place, his nervous system generating a signal of profound wrongness that had no outlet. The sweating was worse. The duration appeared to be longer, though he hadn't yet tested how much longer, because each time he approached that threshold he found a way to use again before reaching it. There was something happening in his body that was different from what had happened before. He didn't have a name for it. He didn't have a way to report it to anyone who could tell him what it meant. Patrice Rourke called her son every Sunday evening. He always answered. His voice on those calls told her things his words didn't. The flatness of it when he was using heavily, the slightly faster cadence when he was doing better, the specific quality of silence before he answered a question that she had learned to read over years of paying attention. On the Sunday evenings of October and November 2023, she heard something in his voice that she hadn't heard before and couldn't name, and lay awake afterward trying to identify. It wasn't the sound of someone using. She knew that sound. It was the sound of someone who was frightened and didn't know yet what they were frightened of. The study that Claire Voss submitted for peer review in March 2023 was 41 pages long, including appendices. Its title was precise in the way that academic titles are required to be precise and completely opaque to anyone outside forensic toxicology. Novel benzimidazole opioid compounds in post-mortem, toxicological analysis, attribution gaps in overdose, death classification, Philadelphia County 2021 to 2022. She had spent 14 months compiling the underlying data and 6 weeks writing the paper itself, working on it in the evenings after her regular research hours because the university position didn't formally include time for independent publication projects. The core finding was this. In a sample of 214 overdose deaths in Philadelphia County, where fentanyl was listed as the primary cause of death, expanded toxicological analysis identified benzimidazole opioid compounds as co-present in 31 cases. In 11 of those 31 cases, the fentanyl concentration alone was insufficient to account for the degree of respiratory depression documented at the scene. In 7 of those 11 cases, the benzimidazole compound present was bromadoline, confirmed against the certified reference standard she had received in January. 7 deaths, attributed to fentanyl, caused, at minimum in part, by something else entirely. 7 was not a large number. In the context of Philadelphia's overdose statistics, 7 deaths over an 18-month period was barely a rounding error. That was precisely what made the finding dangerous, not its size, but its implication. If 7 deaths in one county over 18 months had been misattributed because the testing protocols weren't designed to find bromadoline, then the same misattribution was occurring everywhere that had the same testing protocols, which was everywhere. The journal that accepted the paper was a respected publication in forensic toxicology with a circulation of roughly 4,000 subscribers, the majority of them academic researchers and medical examiners. It published Voss's study in its June 2023 issue. The abstract was accessible online without a subscription paywall. The full text required institutional access. 3 journalists picked up the abstract. 2 of them wrote brief items for public health newsletters with small readerships. The third pitched a longer piece to a national publication and was told the story lacked a compelling human angle. None of the 3 pieces ran in outlets that reached general audiences. The FDA received a copy of the study through its standard academic monitoring process, a program in which staff pharmacologists review newly published research relevant to drug safety. The internal review log, obtained later through a Freedom of Information Act request, shows that the study was received, categorized under novel psychoactive substances, monitoring, and assigned a priority designation of 3 on a scale of 1 to 5. Priority 3 meant review within 90 days. The review was completed 87 days after receipt. Its conclusion, in the internal summary, findings consistent with emerging benzimidazole opioid presence in illicit supply. Sample size insufficient for population-level inference. Recommend continued monitoring. Continued monitoring, not action. Monitoring. Doctor. Meredith Halsey read the study on a Tuesday evening in July 2023 at her kitchen table in Silver Spring, Maryland, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold before she finished the abstract. She was a senior epidemiologist at the CDC's Division of Overdose Prevention, and she had spent 7 years tracking the statistical signatures of drug crises, the patterns that emerged in mortality data before the crisis had a name, before it had appeared on the news, before anyone outside the data was willing to say the word emergency out loud. She recognized the pattern in Voss's study. Not bromadoline specifically. She had not encountered that compound before reading this paper, but the structure of the finding. The gap between what standard testing detected and what was actually killing people. The 7-death undercounting in a single county. She had seen that kind of gap before in 2013, when fentanyl was first appearing in heroin supplies and the testing infrastructure hadn't caught up. She knew what a gap like that meant when it was allowed to widen. The next morning she drafted an internal memo to the division director. It outlined Voss's findings, contextualized them within the existing benzimidazole opioid data the CDC had been passively accumulating, and recommended that the division formally request expanded toxicological screening protocols from state health departments in the 6 states where benzimidazole compounds had been detected in seized drug samples. The memo was 3 pages. The director's response, delivered verbally at a team meeting 10 days later, was that the data was not yet at the threshold required to justify a formal protocol recommendation, and that such a recommendation, if issued prematurely, could create resourcing burdens for state labs that aren't supported by the current evidence base. Halsey revised the memo. She added data. She resubmitted it through a different channel, attaching Voss's study and 3 additional forensic chemistry papers on benzimidazole opioids published in European journals. The revised memo went to a senior policy advisor. She did not hear back for 6 weeks. While Halsey's memo moved through the CDC's internal review process, the DEA was conducting its own assessment of the benzimidazole opioid landscape. This was not a coordinated effort with the CDC. The 2 agencies operated largely in parallel on drug scheduling questions, sharing data formally but not always efficiently. The DEA's assessment was driven primarily by the seized sample data from its field laboratories, which by mid-2023 showed bromadoline detections in samples from Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Michigan. 5 states, with the highest concentration of detections in the corridor connecting Philadelphia to Columbus. A scheduling analyst within the DEA's Diversion Control Division prepared a preliminary evaluation of bromadoline in August 2023. Scheduling a substance under the Controlled Substances Act requires meeting specific criteria. The substance must have a high potential for abuse, it must have no currently accepted medical use, and it must present safety concerns under supervision. Bromadoline met all 3 criteria without ambiguity. It had never been approved for human use anywhere in the world. Its potency and binding profile made abuse potential self-evident. The animal data, Voronin's original research, plus subsequent laboratory modelling, indicated a respiratory depression risk that exceeded fentanyl's. The preliminary evaluation recommended emergency scheduling. Emergency scheduling under the CSA allows the DEA to temporarily classify a substance for up to 2 years while the full scheduling process is completed, a mechanism specifically designed for situations where a novel substance poses an immediate public health threat and the standard multi-year process would be too slow. The recommendation was drafted. It was reviewed. It was prepared for submission to the DEA Administrator's Office for approval. Then it stopped. The mechanism by which it stopped was not dramatic. There was no single phone call, no explicit instruction to halt the process. What happened, according to the internal documents that would later become significant, was a legal inquiry. A law firm filed a formal comment in the DEA's internal review docket, a procedural step that is entirely permitted under federal administrative law and that the DEA is required to consider before finalizing scheduling actions. The comment argued that the evidence base for emergency scheduling of bromadoline was insufficient, that the compound had legitimate research chemistry applications, and that emergency scheduling without adequate evidentiary foundation would set a problematic precedent for the broader research chemical industry. Legal comments of this type are routine. They are filed constantly by pharmaceutical companies, academic institutions, patient advocacy groups, and industry representatives. The DEA is not required to accept their arguments, but it is required to respond to them, and responding takes time. The comment added a minimum of 60 days to the scheduling process. Voss, who was not part of the DEA's scheduling review process and had no formal mechanism for knowing it was occurring, was at that moment running a second round of expanded analysis on samples from the first half of 2023. The bromadoline detections were increasing. Not doubling, increasing by a percentage that plotted on the graph she maintained on her office wall, produced a curve that bent noticeably upward from the third quarter of the year. She wrote to a contact at the DEA's Special Testing Lab, a colleague from her time in Dulles, asking whether the agency was tracking the same trend and whether any scheduling action was being considered. The response she received was collegial and uninformative. The agency was aware of and monitoring developments related to novel benzimidazole compounds, and she would be notified of any relevant public actions. She printed the email and put it in a folder. Then she pulled the folder out again and looked at it for a moment. She had been in this position before, not with bromadoline, but with isotonitazine 4 years earlier. She'd filed a report. The report had been acknowledged. The scheduling had taken 14 months. During those 14 months, people had died. The first death in the United States that was publicly and correctly attributed to bromadoline as a primary cause, not as a co-present compound in a fentanyl case, but as the identified lethal agent, occurred in Columbus, Ohio, in September 2023. The deceased was a 34-year-old man named Gerald Purcell, who had been using opioids for 12 years and who was found unresponsive in his apartment by a neighbour who had noticed the door had been open since the previous evening. The Franklin County Medical Examiner's Office ran a full expanded toxicology panel because the fentanyl concentration in Purcell's blood was low, inconsistent with a lethal overdose in someone with his documented tolerance. The bromadoline level was not low. The report was filed correctly, listing bromadoline as the primary cause of death. The report was accurate. It was also, within the existing classification system, effectively invisible. Because bromadoline was not a scheduled substance, it did not appear in the federal drug mortality databases that tracked overdose causes. It went into the local medical examiner's records. It did not automatically generate a notification to the DEA, the CDC, or any federal public health authority. A copy was sent to the Ohio Department of Health, where it was received and logged. The Ohio Department of Health notified the CDC's overdose monitoring system. That notification arrived in Halsey's division. It was processed. It was added to the database. It was not flagged as an emergency. Gerald Purcell was the first. He was not going to be the last. And everyone with access to the data could see that, could see the curve bending, could see the detections multiplying, could see the gap between what the numbers showed and what the response had so far produced. What they could not yet see, what Voss would not discover until she began pulling at a thread that had nothing to do with toxicology, was that the delay in scheduling bromadoline had a shape that didn't match bureaucratic slowness alone. It matched something else. She found the first piece of it not in a laboratory database but in a patent filing. A routine search of pharmaceutical intellectual property records, conducted as background research for a section of her next paper on the historical origins of benzimidazole opioids. The patent had been filed in 1992 by a pharmaceutical company based in New Jersey. It covered a family of benzimidazole-based analgesic compounds for potential clinical development. The patent had been abandoned in 1997, never converted to an approved drug, never pursued beyond the filing stage. Abandoned patents are public records. Their chemical data is accessible to anyone who knows where to look. The molecular structure described in the 1992 filing was not identical to bromadoline. It was close. Close enough that a trained chemist reading the patent could derive bromadoline's synthesis pathway from it without needing any other source. The patent had been publicly available for 31 years. Anyone could have read it. The question was who had, and what they had done with it. The winter of 2020 did something to the American drug supply that no law enforcement operation, no interdiction effort, no border policy had ever managed to do. It disrupted it. Not permanently, not even significantly in the long arc of the crisis. But for approximately 4 months beginning in March of that year, the supply chains that moved heroin from Mexican production regions into American cities experienced genuine friction. Ports of entry were operating at reduced capacity. The human networks that moved product across the border were stressed by the same logistical collapse that stressed everything else. The street price of heroin in Philadelphia rose 40% between March and June 2020. In Columbus, supply dried up in certain neighborhoods for weeks at a time. The gap was filled, as gaps in drug markets always are, by whatever was available and profitable. Fentanyl, which could be synthesized domestically or imported in quantities small enough to pass through mail systems, filled most of it. The shift that had been gradual through the late 2000s became, in the span of a single season, nearly complete. By the end of 2020, toxicology data from overdose deaths in Philadelphia showed fentanyl present in more than 90% of cases. Heroin, as a distinct product, had effectively ceased to exist in the market. This was not an improvement. The problem with a drug supply that is almost entirely fentanyl is that fentanyl's margin for error is extraordinarily thin. The difference between a dose that produces the desired effect in a person with high tolerance and a dose that stops their breathing is measured in micrograms, units smaller than anything visible to the naked eye, in quantities that vary unpredictably depending on how the drug was mixed and whether it settled evenly through the cutting agent. Experienced users died. People who had survived years on the street died from a single purchase that happened to contain more fentanyl than the one before it. By 2021, a new economic logic was developing at the manufacturing level of the supply chain. Fentanyl synthesis required specific precursor chemicals, primarily from China, that were increasingly subject to export controls and international monitoring agreements. The price of precursors was rising. Manufacturers were looking for alternatives that could deliver equivalent or superior potency at lower production cost with less regulatory exposure. Benzimidazole opioids checked every box. The precursors required for their synthesis were less restricted than fentanyl precursors. The synthesis process, while technically demanding, was achievable in a well-equipped clandestine laboratory. The potency far exceeded fentanyl, meaning smaller quantities could be diluted to larger street volumes. The economic leverage was enormous, and critically, as of 2021, most benzimidazole opioids were not scheduled under American law, which meant that for the manufacturers operating in countries with different regulatory environments, the legal exposure was minimal. The compounds began moving into the American supply not as replacements but as additives, mixed into fentanyl powder at cutting operations, present in quantities too small to detect with standard testing, but large enough to intensify the product's effect. Users felt the difference without understanding it. Dealers reported that certain batches were hitting harder and priced accordingly. The economics reinforced the practice from every direction at once. In Kensington, Danny Rourke felt none of this as economics or policy. He felt it as the specific quality of what he bought on a Tuesday afternoon in February 2022, a batch that hit faster and harder than anything he had used in months, that left him sitting on the floor of his apartment with his back against the radiator for 3 hours because standing required more coordination than he could locate. He didn't overdose. His tolerance was high enough to absorb what would have killed someone with less history. But the experience registered. Something in the product had changed, and the change was not subtle. He didn't know that what he had used contained metonitazine, a benzimidazole opioid that was, at that moment, not yet scheduled under federal law. He had no mechanism for knowing. His dealer didn't know either. The information simply didn't exist at the street level. What he did know, in the weeks that followed, was that his tolerance was climbing faster than it ever had before. The amount he needed to feel normal, not high, just not sick, increased noticeably over a 6-week period. That acceleration was the benzimidazole compound's fingerprint on his neurobiology, though he couldn't have named it that way. The spring and summer of 2022 mark the first period in which deaths clearly linked to benzimidazole opioids began appearing in cluster patterns. Multiple deaths in short geographic proximity and time, the signature of a particularly potent batch moving through a local market. The clusters were small. 3 deaths in a 5-day period in Dayton, Ohio in April. 2 deaths in a single building in Baltimore in June, both on the same evening, both attributed initially to fentanyl. 4 deaths in Pittsburgh across a single week in August, all within 6 blocks of each other. Each cluster was investigated locally. None triggered a federal-level response connecting them to a single compound. The deaths were entered into state and federal mortality databases under existing opioid overdose codes. The pattern, which was visible if someone aggregated the data across states and cross-referenced with the seized sample reports, showing benzimidazole compound detections in the same geographic areas during the same periods, was not being aggregated that way in real time by any agency with the authority to act on it. Halsey, at the CDC, was performing exactly that aggregation, manually, on top of her regular caseload. She was building a spreadsheet that mapped overdose cluster events against confirmed benzimidazole detections in seized samples, looking for the statistical correlation that would give her finding enough weight to force a response. She had been building it since reading Voss's study. She worked on it on weekends. The correlation was there. It was consistent. It was growing stronger with each new month of data. By the fall of 2022, Bromadoline specifically was appearing with increasing frequency in the seized sample data from the Philadelphia to Columbus corridor. Not as a trace additive anymore, as a primary component. In some samples, it was the dominant opioid compound present, with fentanyl present only in minor quantities. The supply dynamic was shifting. Whatever manufacturing source was producing Bromadoline had either increased its output or found better distribution access, or both. Danny Rourke experienced this shift as the moment, in late summer 2023, when the product on his corner changed character entirely. The batch he'd been buying for the previous year, fentanyl primary, benzimidazole adulterated, was replaced by something that, in its effect profile, was categorically different. The change was not gradual. 1 week, it was what it had been. The next week, it wasn't. He was using Bromadoline now, predominantly. He still didn't know that. What he knew was that he needed more of it than he had needed of the previous product to prevent withdrawal, that the withdrawal it produced when he missed a dose arrived faster and gripped harder, and that the physical symptoms, the restlessness, the bone pain, the hypersensitivity to sound and light that made the ambient noise of Kensington feel like something applied directly to the inside of his skull, were lasting longer each time he tested how far he could push before using again. He had pushed once to 22 hours. He had not tried to push further. His body's response at the 22-hour mark, the full body tremors, the retching without producing anything, the heart rate that he could feel in his teeth, had answered the question of whether he could manage a longer stretch without pharmacological support. He could not. The question that Halsey's spreadsheet was building toward, the one she couldn't yet answer from mortality and seizure data alone, was whether Bromadoline's withdrawal profile was genuinely distinct from fentanyl's, or whether the worse outcome she was inferring from the data reflected simply a more potent drug in a more damaged population. The distinction mattered clinically. If Bromadoline produced a withdrawal syndrome that was longer and more physiologically severe than fentanyl withdrawal, then the treatment protocols currently in use, methadone and buprenorphine, both developed and dosed to address the fentanyl and heroin era, might be inadequate. Methadone works by occupying opioid receptors steadily enough to prevent withdrawal while not producing the intense high of street opioids. Buprenorphine works similarly. but with a ceiling effect that limits respiratory depression risk. Both are calibrated, in their standard dosing protocols, to the receptor binding characteristics of classical opioids. Bromadoline's receptor binding was not classical. It was tighter, more persistent, pharmacologically stubborn in a way that had implications for how much methadone or buprenorphine would be required to adequately occupy the receptors it had sensitized. The standard doses might not be enough. Undertreated withdrawal from a benzimidazole opioid, a person in treatment, medicated at a dose calculated for fentanyl dependence, still experiencing significant withdrawal symptoms because the dose wasn't calibrated for bromadoline, would leave people in the exact state most correlated with treatment dropout and return to use. This was not yet confirmed in human clinical data. It was a hypothesis based on pharmacological modeling and animal research. But it was a hypothesis that 3 separate researchers in 3 separate institutions had arrived at independently by mid-2023 and had been unable to test because the population of people dependent primarily on bromadoline was not yet large enough or visible enough to support a formal clinical study. It was becoming large enough. Fast. On the evening of December 4th, 2023, first responders in Dayton, Ohio, were called to 6 separate overdose incidents within a 4-hour window. All 6 victims were found unresponsive. Standard Narcan administration, 2 doses, standard protocol, achieved partial reversal in 4 cases. In the remaining 2, multiple doses were required, and one of those patients required intubation at the hospital to maintain breathing while the drug's effect cleared. The 6 incidents were logged as a cluster event by the Montgomery County Emergency Services Coordination Center. A report was filed with the Ohio Department of Health, standard procedure. The toxicology results from those 6 cases came back over the following 2 weeks. All 6 showed bromadoline as the primary opioid compound. The fentanyl contamination in all 6 cases was minor. This was the first documented cluster event in the United States attributable specifically to bromadoline, not a benzimidazole compound. Bromadoline. Confirmed. Halsey received the Ohio Department of Health's notification on December 19th. She read it at her desk and then read it again. She picked up her phone and called Voss directly, their first voice conversation, despite months of sharing data through email. The call lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, both of them had reached the same conclusion from different directions. The window for a quiet institutional response had closed. What was coming next would not be quiet. They were right. But what neither of them knew yet was that the delay they had been watching build over the previous 18 months, the scheduling recommendation that had stalled, the memo that had been downgraded, the threshold that kept being reset just beyond the reach of the available evidence, had not been purely a product of bureaucratic friction. Someone had been working to keep that window open, and the evidence was sitting in a public database, in a legal filing from a lobbying firm, in a reference number that Voss had written down in the margin of her patent research notes 6 weeks earlier, without yet understanding what it connected to. She was about to understand. The reference number in the margin of Voss's notes was DEA-DCD-2023-0847. She had written it down in October while cross-referencing the DEA's public administrative docket, a database of formal comments, legal filings, and procedural submissions related to drug scheduling actions, against the timeline of bromadoline detection she was building for her second paper. At the time, she had logged it as a routine notation, a law firm comment on a pending scheduling review, filed in September 2023, the kind of procedural submission that appeared in every scheduling docket and usually meant nothing beyond a company protecting a patent interest. She returned to it in January 2024, after the Dayton cluster report and after her phone call with Halsey, had made the scheduling delay feel less like bureaucratic inertia and more like a specific shape with specific dimensions. The filing itself was 11 pages. Its argument was technical, a challenge to the sufficiency of the DEA's evidentiary basis for emergency scheduling, citing the absence of peer-reviewed human clinical data on Bromadoline specifically, and the methodological limitations of seized sample analysis as a basis for scheduling decisions. It was professionally written. It was legally competent. Nothing about it was unusual on its face. What was unusual was the firm that filed it. Hurricane Lawn Associates was a Washington-based lobbying and regulatory affairs firm that did not maintain a public-facing website describing its client list. Its registered lobbying disclosures, required by federal law and publicly available through the Senate's lobbying disclosure database, listed 14 active clients across the pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and specialty chemistry sectors. The firm's reported lobbying expenditures for the first 3 quarters of 2023 totaled $2.3 million. 2 of its listed clients were pharmaceutical companies. The first was a mid-sized specialty pharmaceutical firm based in New Jersey, the same state where the 1992 patent on benzimidazole analgesic compounds had been filed. The second was a biotechnology company that, according to its own investor communications, was developing a novel opioid analgesic for post-surgical pain management, a compound it described in those communications as belonging to a next-generation opioid receptor, binding class with improved duration of action. Voss read the investor communications 3 times. The language describing the compound's receptor binding mechanism, the persistence, the extended duration, the improved ratio of analgesic effect to sedative side effect, was pharmacologically identical to the properties that defined Bromadoline's profile. Not similar, identical. The biotechnology company had not named the compound in its investor communications. It referred to it only as BT114, a development code. No patent had been filed for BT114 under that name, but the company's SEC filings listed, under intellectual property assets, 3 pending patent applications in the area of benzimidazole-based analgesic chemistry. Pending, not yet granted, not yet public. The moment Bromadoline was scheduled under the Controlled Substances Act, any compound structurally similar to it, similar enough to be pharmacologically equivalent, would face immediate scheduling scrutiny as well. Emergency scheduling of Bromadoline would create a legal environment in which BT114, if it was what Voss's reading of the pharmacological description suggested it was, would be significantly harder to bring to market. The patent applications would be reviewed against the scheduling criteria. The clinical development pathway would become more complicated and more expensive. Scheduling Bromadoline was not just a public health decision. It was, for at least one company with active investment in benzimidazole opioid chemistry, a direct financial threat. Voss sat with this for 2 days before she did anything. Not from uncertainty about what she had found. The connection was clear enough that she had written it out in a single paragraph and read it back to herself twice to check whether she was constructing a pattern from coincidence. She wasn't. The lobbying firm's client, the pending patents, the pharmacological description, the timing of the filing relative to the scheduling recommendation. The sequence was coherent, and it pointed in one direction. What she sat with was the question of what to do with it. She was a toxicologist. Her professional tools were mass spectrometers and reference standards and peer review processes that moved in months, not days. What she had found wasn't a toxicological finding. It was a document trail in a public database, connecting a delayed regulatory action to a financial interest that benefited from the delay. It was the kind of thing that required a different kind of expertise to pursue. She called Halsey. Halsey told her to contact a journalist. Nathan Price had been covering the opioid crisis for a Philadelphia-based investigative outlet for 4 years. He was 36, worked out of a shared office space in Fishtown, and had a specific reputation in public health reporting for being willing to spend 3 months on a story that might run at 5,000 words to an audience of 80,000 readers. His previous work had focused on the failures of the city's harm reduction infrastructure and the political economy of addiction treatment. He understood pharmaceutical regulation well enough to read a patent filing and know what he was looking at. Voss contacted him through the outlet's general editorial address in late January 2024. He responded within 4 hours. They met in person 3 days later, a coffee shop on Girard Avenue, 2 miles from Kensington, close enough that the neighbourhood was audible in the sirens that passed the window twice during their meeting. She brought a folder, printed documents, the DEA scheduling docket, the Harwick and Lawn filing, the lobbying disclosure records, the biotechnology company's investor communications, the 3 pages she'd written connecting them. Price read everything while she waited. He asked 4 questions. Then he asked if she had the DEA's internal scheduling recommendation, the draft document that had been prepared before the legal comment arrived. She didn't. That document was internal, not publicly available. He said he knew how to get it. The Freedom of Information Act request that Price filed with the DEA on February 1st, 2024 asked specifically for all internal communications and documents related to DEA docket number DCD-2 023-0847, the same reference number Voss had written in her margin notes 4 months earlier. FOIA requests to the DEA routinely take 6 to 12 months to process. Price filed simultaneously with 2 additional mechanisms, a request through a congressional office and a direct inquiry to a source inside the Diversion Control Division, whose existence he did not document in any written record. The internal documents arrived in partially redacted form on March 14, 2024. There were 34 pages. Most were procedural, but 7 of them were not. The 7 pages were internal email chains from August and September 2023 between senior analysts in the Diversion Control Division and the office of the DEA's Deputy Administrator for Regulatory Affairs. The emails discussed the draft emergency scheduling recommendation for Bromadoline. They discussed the Harwick and Lawn filing, and they contained a sentence, in an email from a senior analyst whose name was redacted, responding to a question from the Deputy Administrator's office about timeline, that read, in its unredacted portion, given the pending comment and the redacted consideration, recommend extending the review period before proceeding to administrator sign-off. The bracketed redaction was 3 words long based on the character spacing. The words weren't visible, but the sentence structure told Price something specific. The extension of the review period had been recommended not solely because of the legal comment's procedural requirements, but because of something else, something the agency had considered and chosen not to disclose in the public docket. He had 7 pages and a 3-word redaction that meant something, and he needed to know what. The answer came not from the DEA, but from the biotechnology company's own documents. In an investor call transcript from October 2023, publicly available because the company was listed on a secondary exchange and required to disclose material communications, the company's chief executive mentioned, in response to an analyst's question about regulatory risk, that the company had engaged proactively with relevant federal agencies regarding the regulatory landscape for its pipeline compounds, and was confident that the development pathway for BT-114 remained clear. Engage proactively with relevant federal agencies. October 2023, 1 month after the Harwick and Lawn filing, 3 months after the draft scheduling recommendation had been prepared. The review period extension that the internal DEA email had recommended was still in effect at the time of that investor call. Price's story ran on April 3, 2024. It was 6,200 words. The headline was specific without being incendiary. Internal DEA documents show Bromadoline scheduling delayed after pharmaceutical lobbying. The subheadline noted the Dayton cluster deaths. The story named the lobbying firm, the biotechnology company, and the investment in benzimidazole opioid chemistry. It quoted the investor call transcript. It reproduced the key sentence from the internal email with the redaction visible and noted the character count. It included Voss's toxicological data, the 18 months of Philadelphia deaths, the Dayton cluster, the 5-state detection pattern. It did not accuse anyone of criminal conduct. It presented the documented sequence and let the sequence speak. By midnight on April 3rd, the story had 41,000 readers. By the following morning, it had been linked by 3 national outlets and picked up by 2 wire services. A senator from Ohio, whose district included Dayton, and who'd been briefed on the cluster deaths by the state health department in December, mentioned it by name during a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on synthetic opioids the following week. The senator asked the DEA's representative at the hearing a direct question about the scheduling delay and the Harwick and Lawn filing. The DEA representative stated that all scheduling decisions followed established legal processes and that public comments were a required and appropriate part of that process. The senator asked a follow-up question about the 3-word redaction. The DEA representative said the redaction protected deliberative process information exempt from FOIA disclosure. The hearing produced no immediate action. The subcommittee chair announced an intention to request unredacted versions of the documents under congressional oversight authority. A timeline for that request was not provided. Voss watched the hearing live stream from her office in Philadelphia. She had a second monitor open beside the hearing feed, displaying her running database of bromadoline detections, the same graph she'd maintained since January 2023, the one with the curve that bent upward in the 3rd quarter of that year and had not flattened since. In the first 3 months of 2024, while the FOIA documents were being processed and Price was writing his story, and the subcommittee was scheduling its hearing, the curve had bent again. Steeper this time. Bromadoline was still not scheduled. It was still legal to manufacture, import and sell in the United States. And somewhere in the supply chain, in the corridor that ran from Philadelphia through the Ohio River Valley, and now beyond it, into new cities that were appearing in Voss's data for the first time, it was moving faster than any of the institutional responses that had so far been attempted. Danny Rourke had been using it for 7 months. His body had adapted to it in the way that bodies adapt to things they cannot escape. And on the morning of April 4th, 2024, the day after Price's story ran, while 41,000 people were reading about a drug they had never heard of, Danny was in the stairwell of a building on Gurney Street, and Sasha Tillman was pulling a Narcan kit from her bag, and the night was doing what the night in Kensington always did. It was waiting to see what survived until morning. Danny Rourke survived the night of October 14th, the way survivors of near-fatal overdoses often do, not through any single decisive intervention, but through an accumulation of small margins, each one barely sufficient, each one necessary. 4 doses of naloxone instead of the standard 2. A paramedic who didn't leave after the first 2 failed but stayed and administered more, which was not strictly within the protocol she was operating under, but which was the reason he was breathing when the ambulance reached Jefferson Hospital. A toxicology team that had, because of Voss's published study and the regional alerts that had followed the Dayton cluster, updated their expanded screening panel 3 weeks earlier to include bromadoline specifically. That last detail mattered more than it should have needed to. Without the updated panel, Danny's tox report would have shown fentanyl at a level inconsistent with his condition, and a second unidentified compound that would have gone into the database as unknown synthetic opioid, further analysis pending. With the updated panel, it showed bromadoline at a primary concentration. His chart became, without anyone intending it, a data point in Voss's database. One more confirmed case. One more curve on the graph that was already bending past the angles that Halsey's spreadsheet had flagged as critical thresholds. He was discharged after 4 days. He left with a referral to a treatment program and a prescription for buprenorphine that the discharging physician wrote with the specific uncertainty of someone medicating a condition they had never formally been trained to treat, adjusting the dose upward from standard because clinical instinct suggested the standard would be insufficient, without being able to cite a study that confirmed it. The prescription was the right instinct. It wasn't enough. The weekend of April 18th through April 20th, 2024, 2 weeks after Price's story ran, 10 days after the Senate subcommittee hearing, produced numbers that broke through the threshold that months of advocacy, published studies, congressional inquiries and investigative journalism had failed to break through. 34 deaths, 6 cities, 72 hours. Philadelphia lost 9 people. Columbus lost 7. Detroit, Baltimore, and Chicago each lost 4. St. Louis lost 6. The deaths occurred across 3 days, in clusters that followed the same geographic logic as every previous bromadoline cluster. Proximity to distribution corridors, concentration in neighborhoods with established opioid markets, victims with histories of a long-term opioid use whose tolerance should have made survival more likely, not less. In every case where multiple Narcan doses were administered before hospital arrival, the reversal was partial or delayed. In 3 cases, first responders documented administering 6 or more doses before achieving sufficient reversal to maintain airway. 6 doses. Standard protocol is 2. The gap between what paramedics were trained to carry and what bromadoline required was not theoretical anymore. It was 34 people in 3 days. The CDC issued an emergency health advisory on April 22, 2024. Health Alert Network Message HAN-00505. It named bromadoline explicitly, the first federal public health document to do so by name in an alert context rather than a monitoring report. It described the compound's pharmacological profile, its naloxone resistance characteristics, and its confirmed presence in the drug supplies of at least 8 states. It recommended that emergency medical providers carry expanded naloxone supplies, that harm reduction organizations distribute information about the compound's characteristics to people who use drugs, and that medical examiners expand toxicological screening to include bromadoline in all opioid overdose deaths. The advisory was thorough. It was appropriately urgent. It contained one absence so significant that Voss, reading it the morning it was released, stopped at the relevant section and read it again to make certain she hadn't missed something. The advisory did not list bromadoline as a scheduled substance, because it wasn't one. The emergency scheduling process, initiated in August 2023, delayed by the Hurricane Lawn filing, slowed by the internal review extension that the redacted DEA email had recommended, had still not produced a final classification. Bromadoline remained, as of April 22, 2024, legal to manufacture, import, distribute, and possess under federal law. Law enforcement agencies reading the advisory had no federal legal basis to seize it. Dealers who stocked it were not, under federal statute, committing a drug offense. The advisory told the country what bromadoline was doing. It had no mechanism to stop it. The national media coverage that followed the 34-death weekend was intense in the way that coverage of drug crises is intense. Concentrated, comprehensive for approximately 72 hours, and then subject to the displacement dynamics of a news cycle that had 17 other emergencies competing for the same attention. The story ran on front pages. It led evening broadcasts. Cable news hosted panels in which experts explained benzimidazole opioids to audiences who had never heard the term before and would retain the broad outline: dangerous new drug, Narcan doesn't work, government knew, without the specific details that made the outline meaningful. Price watched the coverage from his desk in Fishtown and felt the specific frustration of a journalist whose story has been confirmed by catastrophe. His follow-up piece, published April 23rd, focused on the legal status gap, the fact that the advisory named a compound that remained unscheduled, and on the still unresolved question of what the 3-word redaction in the DEA's internal email had covered. The congressional response was faster than the regulatory one. 3 separate House members introduced legislation within the week. 2 bills calling for emergency scheduling of Bromadoline, 1 calling for a broader reform of the emergency scheduling threshold criteria. A Senate resolution was drafted calling for the DEA to act within 30 days or face a congressional oversight hearing specifically on the scheduling delay. The DEA, under pressure from 3 directions simultaneously, announced on April 29th that it was initiating emergency scheduling procedures for Bromadoline. The formal notice was published in the Federal Register on May 2nd. The temporary classification would take effect in 30 days, June 2nd, 2024, 45 days after the 34-death weekend, 731 days after the draft scheduling recommendation had first been prepared internally. The congressional hearing that convened on May 8th was not the Senate subcommittee session from April. That had been preliminary, a single question in a broader synthetic opioids hearing. This was a dedicated session, House Energy and Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Health, titled The Bromadoline Crisis, Federal Response Failures and the Fentanyl Successor Threat. The room was full. C-SPAN carried it live. Claire Voss testified for 40 minutes. She brought a printed copy of her June 2023 study. She brought her database, the 18 months of Philadelphia deaths, the Dayton cluster, the 5-state detection pattern, the graph with the curve. She presented the data in the methodical, precise way that her training required, without editorial language, without characterization, with every number sourced and every methodology footnoted. The subcommittee chair asked her why the study hadn't resulted in faster regulatory action. Voss described the sequence of events accurately: the study's publication, the FDA's Priority 3 classification, the DEA scheduling recommendation, the Harwick and Lawn filing, the review period extension. A congressman from Pennsylvania asked how many people had died in the gap between the first scheduling recommendation and the date of the hearing. Voss gave a number derived from her database and the state mortality report she had collected: a minimum of 340 confirmed Bromadoline-involved deaths across 11 states between August 2023 and May 2024. The room was quiet after that number. Then a congressman from Ohio asked the DEA's deputy administrator, seated at the adjacent witness table, to explain the 3-word redaction in the August 2023 internal email. The deputy administrator stated that the redacted content reflected deliberative process communications exempt from disclosure under FOIA Exemption 5. He stated that the scheduling review process had followed established legal requirements. He stated that the agency took no position on the lobbying activities of private entities that chose to participate in the public comment process. The congressman from Ohio asked whether the agency was aware, at the time of the review extension, that the firm filing the legal comment represented clients with active patent interests in benzimidazole opioid chemistry. The deputy administrator paused for 3 seconds, a pause short enough to be unremarkable in normal conversation, and long enough to be audible in a silent hearing room. Then he stated that the agency did not comment on the specific clients of firms participating in the public comment process. He did not say no. Meredith Halsey was not called to testify at the May 8th hearing. Her name appeared in Voss's written testimony as a collaborator on the cross-agency data aggregation work, a footnote, not a feature. She watched the hearing from her office in Silver Spring, with the spreadsheet she'd been building since July 2023 open on the screen beside the live stream. The spreadsheet now contained data from 19 states. The curve that she and Voss had first identified in the second half of 2023 had not flattened after the media coverage, or after the CDC advisory, or after the congressional attention. It had accelerated. The detections in new states that had not appeared in the data through the end of 2023, were increasing. Missouri, Tennessee, Georgia, Arizona. Cities that had been insulated from the benzimidazole wave by their distance from the original distribution corridor were no longer insulated. The compound was following the existing opioid distribution infrastructure westward and southward, the same way fentanyl had spread a decade earlier, along interstates, along established dealer networks, along the paths of least resistance through a country whose geography of addiction had been stable long enough for new products to navigate it efficiently. The hearing was important. The scheduling action was necessary. Neither one changed the trajectory on Halsey's graph. Danny Rourke, on May 8th, was 43 days into a residential treatment program in northeast Philadelphia. His buprenorphine dose had been adjusted upward twice since admission, because the clinical team, consulting with Voss's published work and with a pharmacologist at Penn, who had begun studying benzimidazole opioid dependence specifically, had concluded that his withdrawal symptoms at standard dosing were consistent with undertreated dependence rather than medication resistance. He was sleeping better. The restlessness in his legs had diminished to something manageable. He was eating regular meals for the first time in 2 years. His mother called every Sunday, same as always. The quality of his voice on those calls had changed in a way she noticed immediately, and did not allow herself to interpret too definitively, because she'd allowed herself to interpret it before and had been wrong before, and the cost of being wrong was a specific kind of damage that she had learned to protect herself from through careful hope rather than full hope. He was alive. He was in treatment. Those were the facts. Whether the treatment was equipped to handle what Bromadoline had done to his brain over the previous year and a half, that question did not yet have a published answer. The researchers who were trying to find one were working as fast as their funding and their data allowed. Neither was sufficient for the speed at which the question needed answering. The temporary scheduling order for Bromadoline took effect on June 2nd, 2024. For the first time since the compound had appeared in American drug supplies, a law enforcement officer who seized a package containing it had a federal legal basis to treat it as a controlled substance. The DEA issued a press release. The Department of Justice issued a supporting statement. Several senators who had been publicly critical of the scheduling delay issued statements welcoming the action. The legal challenge arrived 9 days later. Hurricane Lawn filed a petition for review in the US. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit on June 11th, arguing that the emergency scheduling order had been issued without adequate procedural compliance, specifically that the agency had failed to adequately respond to the substantive arguments in the firm's September 2023 public comment before proceeding to classification. The petition did not ask the court to immediately suspend the scheduling order. It asked for an expedited briefing schedule and a formal evidentiary hearing on the adequacy of the DEA's evidentiary basis. Under federal administrative law, the petition was entirely legitimate. The court accepted it for review. The briefing schedule it established stretched into early 2025. The scheduling order remained in effect during the litigation, but the litigation itself cast a procedural shadow over enforcement actions, creating enough legal uncertainty that prosecutors in several districts began noting in case files that convictions obtained during the pendency of the appeal carried appellate risk. The scheduling order was simultaneously law and contested terrain. While the legal proceeding moved through its early stages, something else happened. Something that Voss, with her database and her graph and her 18 months of pattern recognition, had predicted in a paper she submitted for publication in July 2024, though the prediction was buried in a methods section that most readers would skip. The manufacturers adapted. Within 60 days of the June 2nd scheduling order, seized samples from DEA field laboratories in Ohio and Pennsylvania began showing a compound that was not bromadoline, but was structurally adjacent to it, a molecule that differed from bromadoline at a single position in its benzimidazole side chain, a modification small enough to be achieved by a competent synthetic chemist in an afternoon, large enough to place the resulting compound outside the specific molecular definition covered by the emergency scheduling order. The new compound's pharmacological profile, assessed through the same receptor-binding modelling that had characterized bromadoline, was functionally equivalent. Same potency range, same receptor-binding persistence, same naloxone resistance characteristics, same withdrawal profile, different molecule, different legal status. The DEA's scheduling action had closed one door. The door had been replaced within 60 days by another door standing in the same frame. Voss named the new compound in her database BZ07, a placeholder designation while formal characterization was completed. She ordered reference standards. They took 6 weeks to arrive. When she ran the first confirmed identification in late August 2024, she added it to the graph she'd maintained since January 2023. The curve, which had shown a slight flattening in June and July as the scheduling order disrupted the original supply chain, resumed its upward trajectory in August, driven now by BZ07 detections rather than bromadoline. The shape of the curve was identical to the one bromadoline had traced 18 months earlier. The starting point was lower, the slope was the same. She filed a preliminary detection report with the DEA on September 3, 2024. It was received and acknowledged. She was told the compound would be evaluated for scheduling consideration through standard procedures. Standard procedures, at their fastest, took 14 months. Danny Rourke completed his 90-day residential program on July 25, 2024. He left with a continuing buprenorphine prescription, a twice-weekly outpatient counselling schedule at a clinic on Frankfurt Avenue, and a connection to a peer support specialist, a man named Terence who'd been in recovery for 6 years and who met Danny every Thursday morning for coffee at a diner on Kensington Avenue, 3 blocks from the corner where Danny had bought his last supply. The proximity was deliberate. The clinical team had debated it. Terence had argued for it, on the basis that Kensington wasn't a place Danny could avoid indefinitely, and that learning to navigate it in recovery was more durable than learning to navigate an environment that didn't resemble his actual life. For 4 months, it worked. Danny attended his counselling sessions. He took his medication. His sleep normalised. He got a job. Stock work at a grocery warehouse in Port Richmond early shift, starting at 5 in the morning, which meant he was up and occupied during the hours that had historically been most dangerous for him. Patrice, on their Sunday calls, heard something in his voice she was careful not to name because naming it felt like pressure. He relapsed in late November 2024, not on bromadoline, on fentanyl obtained from someone he encountered outside a convenience store on a Tuesday evening after his shift. A brief exchange, a familiar transaction, the muscle memory of 11 years expressing itself in a moment when the distance between the decision and its execution was shorter than any therapeutic intervention could reliably close. He didn't overdose. He used twice more over the following week, then told his outpatient counsellor at their next scheduled session. The counsellor adjusted the treatment plan. The program didn't discharge him for the relapse, a policy that reflected a clinical understanding of addiction's trajectory that was more current than the zero-tolerance approaches that still governed many programs. He continued, "It wasn't a collapse. It was a fracture, contained, reported, addressed." The difference between those two outcomes was, in large part, the infrastructure around him. A counsellor who received the information without punishment, a medication that continued without interruption, a peer supporter who met him the following Thursday at the same diner on Kensington Avenue and sat across from him while he described what had happened. That infrastructure was not available to most people in Danny's situation. Most treatment programs in the country still used abstinence contingent models that discharge patients for relapse. Most did not have peer support specialists trained specifically in benzimidazole opioid recovery, because that specialty didn't yet formally exist. Most were operating on protocols written for the fentanyl era, the same way the fentanyl era protocols have been written for the heroin era, each generation of response lagging one crisis behind the one it was trying to address. In October 2024, a research team at Johns Hopkins published a paper in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology that received less public attention than its findings warranted. The paper reported the results of a study examining neurological markers in a small cohort of individuals with confirmed long-term benzimidazole opioid exposure. 12 participants, identified through forensic and clinical records, compared against matched cohorts with comparable histories of fentanyl dependence and no prior opioid use. The findings were specific and disturbing in a way that differed categorically from what was already known about opioid neurotoxicity. Long-term benzimidazole opioid exposure was associated with measurable changes in dopaminergic signaling in the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward processing center, that were distinct from the changes produced by equivalent fentanyl exposure. The differences were structural. The benzimidazole-exposed group showed significantly reduced density of dopamine D2 receptors in regions associated with reward anticipation, motivation, and the capacity to experience pleasure from non-drug stimuli. Reduced receptor density of this kind was not new in opioid research. Chronic opioid use of any kind produces some degree of this effect, which is part of why recovery involves a prolonged period of anhedonia, the clinical term for the inability to feel pleasure. What was new was the magnitude. The benzimidazole-exposed group's receptor density reduction was, on average, 34% greater than the fentanyl-exposed groups, despite comparable duration and frequency of use. The implication, stated carefully in the paper's discussion section, was that extended benzimidazole opioid dependence might cause a degree of dopaminergic restructuring that made the neurological baseline of recovery, the starting point from which a person's brain could begin to recover its natural reward processing, significantly lower than the baseline left by classical opioid dependence. The brain, in some cases, did not return to where it had been before. It returned to somewhere else. 12 participants, a small sample. The paper's authors acknowledged the limitation explicitly and called for larger studies. But 12 was enough to establish a signal, and the signal was clear enough that 3 addiction medicine specialists who read the paper in the weeks after publication contacted the lead researcher independently to describe what they were observing clinically. Patients in benzimidazole opioid recovery who were failing to respond to standard relapse prevention protocols in patterns that, now that they had a framework for understanding it, made a different kind of sense. Patrice Rourke found out about the Johns Hopkins paper not from a medical professional, but from a family support group she'd been attending since Danny entered residential treatment. A weekly meeting held in the basement of a church in Frankfurt, organised by a harm reduction non-profit, attended by parents and siblings and partners of people in various stages of addiction and recovery. A woman in the group whose daughter had been in benzimidazole opioid treatment for 5 months mentioned the paper, having read a summary of it in an online forum for families of people in recovery. The summary was imprecise in the way that summaries of scientific papers passed through non-specialist communities often are. The nuances of sample size and confidence intervals didn't survive the translation. What survived was the core finding, simplified to its most alarming form. The new drug did permanent damage to the brain that made getting better harder. Patrice took that version home with her. She sat with it in her kitchen, in the apartment on Cambria Street she had lived in for 26 years, and she did what she had done through every stage of her son's addiction. She converted it from a thing she couldn't control into a task she could perform. She wrote down a list of questions to ask his outpatient counsellor. She researched the Johns Hopkins team's contact information. She wrote an email to the lead researcher, a careful, specific email, asking whether the study's findings had implications for treatment protocols and whether larger studies were planned. The researcher responded within a week. The response was honest about the limitations of the current data and the timeline for follow-up research. It confirmed that larger studies were planned, pending funding. The funding application was under review. Patrice wrote the response down in a notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer and underlined the word pending. The court case initiated by Harwick and Lawns' June 2024 petition was still in its briefing phase as of the end of the year. The biotechnology company whose investor communications had described BT114 in language matching bromadoline's pharmacological profile had not publicly acknowledged any connection between its pipeline compound and the scheduling action. Its stock price had declined 18% in the week following Price's April story, and recovered most of that loss by August. The 3 pending patent applications in benzimidazole analgesic chemistry remained under USPTO review. The unredacted version of the DEA's August 2023 internal email, the one with the 3-word redaction, had not been released. The congressional request for unredacted documents was still working through the administrative process. The subcommittee chair had not yet scheduled a follow-up hearing. Voss's BZO-7 detection report sat in the DEA's evaluation queue. Her database showed BZO-7 in samples from 7 states as of December 2024. The curve on her graph was the same shape it had always been. She'd started a new folder. The label on the tab, written in the same careful hand she used for everything, read BZ08 Preliminary Indicators. She didn't have confirmed samples yet. She had the spectral data from 2 cases, anomalous readings that didn't match bromadoline, didn't match BZ07, didn't match anything in the current reference library. The same place she had been in November 2022, when the bromadoline reference standard hadn't yet arrived and she was looking at signals she couldn't name. The reference standard for BZ08, if BZ08 was what those readings represented, would need to be synthesized first. That required knowing the compound structure precisely enough to produce a certified sample. That required more data than 2 anomalous readings provided. She'd submitted requests to 3 forensic chemistry laboratories, asking them to flag any samples matching the spectral signature she had documented. She was waiting. The waiting was the part of this work that never ended. The compounds didn't wait with her. Jefferson Hospital's emergency department on the night of February 7th, 2025 looked the same as it had on the night of October 14th, 2024. The same fluorescent lights running at a frequency that made the white walls look faintly yellow. The same double doors that swung open every few minutes, admitting cold air and whoever the night had decided to deliver. The same trauma bay at the end of the central corridor, curtained off from the rest of the department, where the cases that arrived without warning and required everything at once were worked on by people who who had learned to move quickly without appearing to hurry. Danny Rourke was not there that night. He was in his apartment in Port Richmond, a single room he had rented 4 months earlier, when transitioning out of the supportive housing connected to his treatment program, a room with a window that looked out onto a fire escape and a street that was quiet enough at 2 a.m. that he could hear the traffic signal on the corner clicking through its cycle. He was asleep. He had work at 5. His medication was on the windowsill in a weekly pill organizer that his outpatient counsellor had suggested, and that he had initially resisted and eventually adopted because it meant one fewer decision to make in the early morning hours when decisions were hardest. He was not the patient brought in that night. That was someone else entirely. The paramedics who delivered her were a different crew from Sasha Tillman's unit. 2 men, both younger, one 18 months on the job. They had found her in the doorway of a laundromat on Allegheny Avenue, the same street where Danny had bought his first heroin at 18 years old. She was 22. Her name, from the statey D in her jacket pocket, was Rosa Vela. Her lips were the same shade of blue that Tillman had documented in her incident report from October, a colour that Philadelphia paramedics had developed a specific language for among themselves, not because the language made it easier, but because language was the only tool available for things that were otherwise just weight. 2 doses of naloxone in the field. Partial response. A 3rd dose in the ambulance produced enough respiratory improvement to maintain oxygen saturation above the threshold that required intubation, but only barely. The younger paramedic held the bag valve mask against her face for the entire transport, manually assisting each breath, counting the intervals the way he had been trained to count them, not looking away. She was alive when the trauma bay doors opened. That margin, again. That specific and unreliable margin. The attending physician who received Rosa Vela had been working at Jefferson for 11 years. She had treated Danny Rourke in October, had been the one to order the expanded tox panel that had identified bromadoline as the primary compound in his system. She had attended the hospital's internal training session on benzimidazole opioids that had been organised in November, following the CDC advisory, following the congressional hearing, following the cascade of institutional response that had finally produced updated protocols for emergency departments in cities where the compound was confirmed in the drug supply. She ordered the expanded panel immediately upon Rosa Vela's arrival. She administered a 4th naloxone dose while the panel was processing. She noted in the chart under presenting symptoms that the patient's respiratory depression was disproportionate to the fentanyl level suggested by her physical presentation, the same clinical signal that Voss had identified in her 2023 study as a marker for benzimidazole compound involvement. The tox panel came back in 40 minutes. The physician was with another patient when the result appeared in the system. Her resident flagged her. She crossed the corridor, read the screen, and read it again. Fentanyl present. Minor concentration. Primary compound. Novel benzimidazole opioid. Unclassified. No reference match in current panel library. Not bromadoline. The panel now included bromadoline specifically, the updated protocol Voss's work had made possible. The compound in Rosa Vela's system matched the benzimidazole scaffold, matched the binding characteristics, matched the naloxone resistance profile. It did not match bromadoline's specific molecular signature. It didn't match BZ07 either. That had been added to the panel in December. The screen displayed what the system displayed when it encountered a compound outside its reference library. Novel synthetic compound. Further analysis required. The physician had seen that notation before, twice, both times in the past 4 months. She printed the tox result and walked to her office at the end of the corridor. The CDC advisory from April was on her desk, the physical printout she had kept there since receiving it, annotated in the margins with the protocol updates she had integrated into her practice. It listed bromadoline by name. It described the benzimidazole opioid family. It was the most current federal guidance available. The compound in Rosavela's blood was not on it. The physician picked up her phone and called the hospital's toxicology consultant, a standing arrangement that Jefferson had established after October, specifically for cases involving novel synthetic compounds. The consultant was not immediately available. She left a message with the specific spectral data points from the panel result, read from the screen into the voicemail with the precise care of someone who understood that the numbers mattered more than any description of them. Then she went back to the trauma bay. Rosavela's breathing had stabilized. The naloxone was holding. She was not conscious, but her oxygen saturation had climbed to a level that no longer required active manual support. The younger paramedic, who had stayed longer than his handoff required, was standing at the foot of the bay watching the monitor with the focused attention of someone who had spent 40 minutes keeping this person breathing and was not entirely ready to stop being responsible for it. The physician checked the monitor. She checked the IV line. She made a note in the chart about the novel compound and the absence of a reference match, and the need for extended monitoring given the unknown duration of action. Duration of action. That was the other thing. With Bromadoline, the effect lasted longer than fentanyl, which was why partial naloxone reversal could deteriorate hours after apparent stabilization, as the drug's grip on the receptor reasserted itself when the naloxone dose wore off. With an unknown compound in the same family, the duration was itself unknown. The standard observation window might not be sufficient. She extended the monitoring order to 12 hours. Then she reconsidered and extended it to 18. Outside the hospital, Philadelphia was doing what Philadelphia did at 3 a.m. in February, contracting against the cold, the streets emptying to the people who had nowhere else to be, and the vehicles that serviced a city that never fully stopped. On Kensington Avenue, the harm reduction van operated by a non-profit that had been working that corridor for 9 years was parked in its usual spot near the intersection with Allegheny, staffed by 2 workers who distributed clean supplies, naloxone kits, and information about treatment options to whoever approached the window. The naloxone they distributed was the same formulation it had always been. They had increased the quantity per kit from 2 doses to 4 after the CDC advisory. They had added printed cards describing benzimidazole opioids in language accessible to people who had no pharmacology background. A new type of drug, stronger than fentanyl, harder to reverse, requires more Narcan. The cards had been designed by a graphic designer who volunteered with the non-profit and who had used the simplest possible visual language: a diagram, a number, an instruction. Whether those cards reached the people using whatever Rosavela had used that night, whether the distribution network had adapted fast enough to the new compound to put information about it in the hands of people who needed it before those people encountered it in a doorway, was not a question the van workers could answer. They distributed what they had. They worked the window until 4:30. They drove back to the non-profit storage facility in Fishtown, restocked, logged the night's contacts in the database that the organisation submitted monthly to the City Health Department. The database was one of the data sources Voss used in her research. The monthly submission went into the system. The system processed it. The information moved. It moved at the speed of institutions. The compound moved faster. In the 12 months following the first major national media coverage of Bromadoline, from April 2024 through March 2025, deaths from causes classified as unspecified novel synthetic opioid in the CDC's mortality tracking system rose 31% compared to the equivalent period the prior year. The classification was a catch-all for compounds that didn't fit existing categories. Compounds that appeared in tox reports as benzimidazole opioids, but that couldn't be attributed to a specific named substance because the reference library didn't yet contain them, because the testing panel hadn't been updated to include them, because the gap between the compound's appearance and the regulatory and scientific infrastructure's ability to name it was measured in months that the compound did not wait through. 31%. In the year when Bromadoline became the most discussed novel drug in American public health history, when it was named in a CDC advisory, scheduled under federal law, examined in a congressional hearing, covered on every major news platform, in that year, the number went up by nearly a third. Not because the response failed completely, because the response addressed Bromadoline while the supply chain was already producing what came after Bromadoline. Claire Voss received a response from the third of the 3 forensic chemistry laboratories she had contacted in September 2024, the laboratories she had asked to flag samples matching the BZ08 spectral signature, on the morning of February 8, 2025. The laboratory was in Columbus, Ohio. The response confirmed that they had identified 2 samples in their November and January seized drug analyses that matched the spectral parameters she had specified. 2 samples, Ohio. Consistent with the geographic pattern she had tracked from Bromadoline's first appearance. The same corridor, the same cities, the same distribution infrastructure expressing itself through a new product. She added the data points to her database. She updated the BZ08 folder, the one with the label written in careful hand, the one she'd started when she had nothing but 2 anomalous readings and a shape on a graph she recognized from before. She began drafting the preliminary detection report that protocol required her to submit to the DEA. She knew the timeline. She had lived the timeline twice already. The report would be received and acknowledged. The compound would be evaluated. The process would take the time it took, faster now perhaps than it had taken for Bromadoline, because the agency was under more scrutiny and had updated some of its procedures after the congressional hearing. Faster, but not fast. The samples from Columbus were being expedited to a specialist laboratory for full characterization. Until that characterization was complete, BZ08 was a label on a folder and a shape on a graph. In the Jefferson Hospital trauma bay, Rosavella's eyes opened for the first time at 4:47 in the morning. She did not know where she was. The resident on duty noted the time and the level of consciousness in the chart and went to stand at the bedside. Rosavella looked at the ceiling, then at the IV in her arm, then at the monitor displaying her vitals in green numbers. She did not speak. She turned her head toward the window, where the February dark was beginning its slow transaction with the first grey light of morning. The tox result from her case had been flagged for forwarding to the city health department, which would forward it to the state, which would forward it to the CDC's monitoring system, which would log it in the database that Halsey's division used to track novel compound detections. The process would take approximately 3 weeks. The physician stopped in at 6:15 before the end of her shift. She checked the chart. She checked the monitor. She looked at the printout of the CDC advisory still on her desk, the one that listed Bromadoline, the one that represented the most current federal guidance available. She thought about the compound that had come back on Rosavella's panel, the one with no reference match, the one the system had filed under the same notation it always used for things it hadn't seen before. Nobody had named it yet.